Hello, my name is Pavel, and I'm the voice you will hear as my father, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the former CEO of UCAS, and now a humanitarian and philanthropist, tells his unbelievable story. I have been living in the United States since 2003, the year my father was placed under arrest by Vladimir Putin. When he was released 10 years later, in December 2013, it was the greatest Christmas present a son could ever imagine.
Mikhail Khodorkovsky, I'd like to take you back a few years. You flew into Siberia on your jet at 5 in the morning, and secret police commandos raided your jet and arrested you. And your response was, "I felt total relaxation." What was going through your mind?
Over a span of several months, there was the expectation that this arrest was about to happen. I was resisting the political drift of my country at that time. I wasn't the only one, but I was a focus. The way things were evolving became perfectly clear to me. Shortly before, they had arrested an employee of my company, and then a friend. I realized they were preparing to arrest me. They allowed me to leave and hoped that I would stay out of the country. But I felt I had to return, and once I did, the countdown started. So, you could say a certain weight lifted off my shoulders.
Для меня было некое облегчение. Ну вот, наконец, все и разрешилось.
As a young boy, you were a leader in the Communist Youth League, and yet you became a great capitalist. How did that happen?
Мы должны понимать, что в то время, когда
You need to understand the times we were in. When I was growing up in the Soviet Union, the Communist Youth League was an ordinary part of everyday life. For example, in the US right now, some children are homeschooled. This might seem a bit extravagant to some, but it's done. In the same way, in the Soviet days, if you didn't send your kids to the Communist Youth League, that was viewed as an extravagant gesture. But unlike North Korea or East Germany, everybody was less serious about ideology. So metaphorically, we had to dress alike, but what we were actually thinking didn't concern people all that much. That said, I was absolutely convinced at the time that the proper path was socialist communism. In today's America, a significant part of the population seems to think the same, and in Europe, the majority feels this way.
существенная часть населения думает так же.
Was there a tipping point that changed you?
Когда в России начались изменения,
Change came to the Soviet Union in the early 90s. That was when we got to see an entirely new world we hadn't known existed. For example, my dream since childhood was to be a plant manufacturing director, but I knew it could only be accomplished at a relatively later stage of life. Now, all of a sudden, I got this unexpected opportunity to head an operation.
Tell me, were people surprised by your ambition?
более старшие и опытные товарищи
Yes, older people especially were very skeptical. They said, "What do you want to do in your life? Do you want to follow a serious life path, or do you want to play perestroika games?" In those days, this was the name they gave to business startups, perestroika games. You need to understand, in the Soviet Union, starting a business was permitted by one document, but another document, and one that had not been repealed, called it a crime. So, with an understandable tremor in my voice, I told my older colleagues, "I think I want to engage in these perestroika games." They looked at me like I was an idiot. Until that point, what had been my normal life trajectory ceased forever.
You once said if the old communist Mikhail met the new one, that he would shoot him. I notice you're still alive.
я начал заниматься
I started engaging in entrepreneurial activity by the end of 1986. But it took time, about 5 years before I was able to make a total shift of consciousness. We're talking about the period between when I was 23 and 28, so I was quite young still.
молодым человеком.
You became an advisor to Boris Yeltsin, CEO of Yukos. How did you rise up so quickly?
Я вам уже сказал, что я с самого раннего
It seems I was destined in some way. In nursery school, they asked me, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" I didn't say airplane pilot, I said plant director. I had another, perhaps sentimental reason. One of the walls of the daycare center was next door to the wall of the plant. My parents worked at that plant, and the plant director was the most important person there. So I literally had in me from the earliest childhood this idea to become a leader.
Now, when you went to Yukos, it was a collection of failed assets, and you turned it into the second largest oil company in all of Russia. How challenging was that?
На самом деле это был приблизительно четвертый.
Technically, this was the fourth large business that I developed up until that time in my life. I made 4 companies that subsequently were worth over $1 billion.
Я всю жизнь работал.
All my life, I worked in companies engaged in chemistry, which I studied in college. At the time, Yukos had about 120,000 employees, but just as importantly, it was 6 months in arrears on paying wages and $3 billion in tax arrears. So the first thing I did was to ask the former CEO of the company to fly with me to areas where we were producing oil and to introduce me to the workforce. Unfortunately, he neglected to inform me in advance the employees had not been paid wages for 6 months.
Зарплате это много.
So I take it the employees were not so thrilled to meet you.
When I first met with the workers, they let me know not only did I owe them back salary, but they expected a raise too. I said to them, there is an easy way we can solve this problem. Since I don't have any money to pay back wages, all I can do would be to fire you and hire new people to replace you. But I said I had a better idea. Here's where the idea of becoming what you might call a business leader started to take hold. First, I said to them, let's get this business back on its feet. Then I can pay you back wages. This took some risk, as you will see, because in Russia at the time, the big question was, would they believe me?
There you were talking to your labor force about back wages and giving them an option. How different is dealing with Russian labor than it would be in the United States?
В Америке, так сказать, в этой ситуации.
In the US, it is more nuanced, as unions might be involved. But in Russia, things are simpler, as these workers could simply beat me up and take me out. On one hand, we don't have unions. On the other hand, they didn't beat me up. So as you say, there are pluses and minuses. By 1998, we were able to lift the company back on its feet.
In other words, you performed what we call a turnaround. Was that the end of it and the beginning of good times for you?
Но результат.
Only just as soon as the company was doing okay again, we had paid back the wage arrears and the crisis had been avoided, the bottom fell out of the market. Oil was $12 a barrel. Getting the oil to the market cost $4 a barrel. Taxes, another $4. That leaves you $4 gross profit. But my lifting cost is $12. So I had to come up with another turnaround plan. I gathered the workers together, 700 of them, who represented the 60,000 people in that region alone. I say, guys, here is a new deal. The first thing that has to happen is you've got to agree to a 30% wage reduction. You're going to have to vote in favor of that. Again, it was a stark choice. Either they agree or they can take me out. Instead, they asked, when will you return our money? I said, in a year, and they agreed.
What do you think you did that convinced them to hang in there with you?
It wasn't just what I said, but what I said to them personally. I traveled to all the regions across our giant country and spoke to the workforce about their doubts and slowly was able to convince them. But I also warned it's not going to be easy. After that, I had to take severe action and reduce the workforce 2 times in the following year. I just simply had no other choice. But finally, our productivity began to pay off. I knew it was the beginning of the end of the trouble when our lifting cost came down from $12 to $1.50. This wasn't just due to staff reductions, of course. We also changed our technologies. But in order to change the technologies, we had to change the culture. And to do that, we needed to show that the situation was really, really dire.
What was wrong with the culture, and was it peculiar to doing business in Russia?
Приведу пример.
I'll give an example. In the oil business, you have to lay pipes into a trench. They're wrapped in insulation. If this insulation gets damaged in any way, the pipes will have a useful lifespan of 2 to 3 years instead of 15. That's why they lay these pipes on a bed of soft fabric and sand while you're watching. But the moment you turn your eyes away, they pull out a bulldozer and toss the pipe into the trench.
Трубу сталкивают бульдозером туда.
Were there also social issues that you had to deal with?
Пришел пьяный на работу.
Drunkenness at work is another example. The first time I came to the company, the head of one of the units that numbered several tens of thousands of people was lying in the gutter, drunk. And this wasn't an isolated case, it was the norm. 2 years later, there were almost no cases of people coming to work drunk. The few cases that did occur, I looked at those personally. Until you deal with all that, you can bring in new technologies, but you can't get anything to work right until you've convinced the people they need to change. You see, running a business in Russia, you don't have the power to make workers do anything. There's no police. There is no authority. There is only you and your relationship with the workers.
Ничего нету.
In running UCOS, you managed some of the toughest people in the oil business. How did you convince them to follow you?
Первое, что я сделал после того, как познакомился с...
After I'd made the acquaintance of most of the workers, I went through the whole oil production chain and actually worked for a week or a week and a half at every job. I've got a dozen specializations. For instance, when the workers are way out in the field, they spend 2 weeks living in trailers. I went into the field and I lived in a trailer for weeks. I still remember this.
Рабочим местам прошел.
Can you think of any examples where your interaction was particularly important?
Когда я приезжал...
This is a really amusing situation that happened there. There's about 150 guys there that gathered together to chat with me. At one point I asked, "Raise your hands, how many of you have done time in prison?" All hands went up. Then I said, "Okay, who has been in jail twice or more?" Again, the same hands. Then a third time in prison, and so on. Yet, all during that time, I felt perfectly comfortable interacting with them. I never had the feeling that they were subordinate to me. Frankly, it was the same situation when I myself was in prison too.
If you Google your name, Khodorkovsky, it says that you were the richest Russian oligarch and were worth $15 billion. Is that true or false?
Мы должны понимать,
First of all, let's understand what $15 billion means here. This is the value of the shares I held as long as I was at the helm. The largest shareholders owned 60% of the shares and I held half of their total. When I had to resign, I had to forfeit most of my shares, so 15 billion is a paper number. I always took a very calm attitude about the description of my wealth. In our line of work, unlike in Silicon Valley, if your company doesn't have much revenue, it isn't worth much either. Had I known that there was a sector like technology where you could make losses and still be worth billions, I might have gone into that sector. Unfortunately, I didn't know that then.
Does it ever bother you that people resent your wealth?
Когда меня спрашивают...
When people ask, I tell them, I got 3% of the incremental growth of the company during my tenure. I think that's fair.
На мой взгляд, это честно.
When you look back, are there any mistakes and do you regret them?
Что для меня дискомфортно, где я действительно...
What I do feel uncomfortable about is there were mistakes made and I had to fix them subsequently. Actually, I'm not sure how well an American audience will be able to understand this. As the head of the company, my focus was 100% on the company. So people ask, why didn't you also engage in fixing social problems? I respond, in those days it didn't even occur to me. I was a young person who had become the head of a big company. I honestly felt that what I should be doing is focusing on my work, and matters of state should be handled by others. Once I realized that, I did start to face those issues and created two organizations called the New Civilization and Federation of the Internet Education that focused on those issues. I admit, I should have seen this earlier and done something sooner. I do feel bad that I didn't realize the biggest problems were not about running a company.
Основная проблема решается не в вопросе управления компанией.
When you're running a company the size of Yukos, is it lonely at the top?
У меня за мою жизнь
In my life, I had roughly 6 global partners, and I could call on them for advice at any time. But it was always a given that I'm the one that bears the responsibility for making the final decision. You could say that is a lonely place. That, by the way, was one of the reasons I returned to Russia once the attacks against us by the administration began. You see, I felt I was responsible for the company. I had to deal with it.
When you made the decision to return, did you have any idea how tough it was going to be for you?
Мы разговаривали с моими друзьями.
I had talks with friends before I returned. Yes, there was no doubt I was assuming I would spend from 2 to 4 years in jail. It's not that I was looking forward to it, but I was ready to do that. When it turned out to be 10 years, I would call that a little on the too much side.
Немножко многовато.
How did 10 years in a Russian labor camp change you?
Мне очень сложно сказать, как я изменился вследствие того, что
It's very hard for me to distinguish between how I changed in 10 years because I was in prison and because I got 10 years older. But I do have some observations to share. In jail, I met people who belonged there, I'm afraid to say. I concluded that for many of these people it would be better for everyone if they were never let out. I also met people who never want to leave the jail. Some people in Russian jails tattoo prison cell bars across their face, a sign they will refuse liberation, refuse to be free. Then, the overwhelming majority of people I saw in Russian prisoners are very young. These are people that need to be worked with because the prison system as it stands creates desocialized people out of them.
абсолютно десоциализированных личностей.
We have the same problems in the United States. What do you think is the biggest challenge facing former prisoners?
Человек, который на протяжении
The biggest problem they face is after prison. They've been out of the workforce for several years and it's hard to get back. The most important thing is that these are young people, and what is being beaten into the heads in prison is you needn't think. Do not think. The leadership does all your thinking for you. Now, this person gets released. The military won't take them, even though the military is a place where don't think might actually be a useful skill. Nobody's going to hire them for any decent job because everybody needs independent thinkers.
So former prisoners are cast out onto society. What happens to them?
то, что у нас называется
The
криминальная
one
пехота.
place is into crime, where they play the role of foot soldiers. You go to work for a so-called criminal organization. There, don't think, just do is exactly what is required. Some guy tells you, go in and beat that person up. You don't think, you just go and beat that person up. I spoke with the prison authorities on many occasions. I asked them, what are you doing? Don't you realize you've created a factory for producing gangsters? Their answer, what can we do? These are our instructions. I think this is something that absolutely has to be changed.
Нравится, я думаю, что это та вещь, которую надо будет очень серьезно менять.
When you were released from prison, you were quoted as saying it was like an autumn rain, an unpleasant phenomenon, and nothing more. How could you be so calm?
Это то, как я воспринимаю.
This is just how I perceive things, but I'm not so calm about everything. There are people for whom I have powerful negative feelings. One of these, Igor Sechin, I would call my bitter enemy. If I can do something to ensure that he ends his life in jail, I'm going to do that. Why? Because he crossed the line and made it personal.
Tell us just how did he cross the line?
В результате его
A
действий
young lawyer who worked for my company died because of him. It wasn't just by accident. It was intentional killing.
целенаправленно,
It was a hard and heavy death.
да, так сказать, за
In 1 year in jail, this person went from stage 1 AIDS to stage 4 because they refused to give him medicine. The reason they weren't giving him the medicine was because they wanted him to give certain testimony against me.
всё, это
Now
личное.
that's personal.
Do you agree with chess master Garry Kasparov, who said the word for fake news in Russian is news?
Ну, я понимаю, почему он так говорит.
Well, I know why he said what he said. The actual situation is more nuanced. If you talk to Russian people, you'll find they know what's going on.
Да, новости
News is not hidden.
формируются.
Sometimes news is distorted, or the order in which stories are presented aren't necessarily in the order of importance. What those who criticize Russian news are missing isn't the news, it's what Putin's propaganda machine is doing. It has learned how to make people believe in presumptions. For example, you and I can see this brick wall here. We may have our own impressions about whether this is a pretty wall or not, but if I take 10 people and I say, look at how ugly this wall is, 8 of those people are going to be under the presumption the wall is ugly. This is what Putin's propaganda does. This is what we're trying to fight.
Мы пытаемся бороться.
As you're aware, a special prosecutor in the United States was appointed to investigate what we call the Russian hack of the 2016 election. News reports showed that Russian-linked accounts boosted everyone from Bernie Sanders, a presidential candidate, to Black Lives Matter. What was the strategy?
Я не знаю, Америка
There was none.
переоценивает или не переоценивает.
But I understand why Americans are in a huff.
Понимание, что влияние
If I intentionally step on your toes, it's not all that relevant whether your toe got hurt or not. You will be angry at me.
ну, вы рассердитесь.
Do you believe Vladimir Putin played a role or was behind the hacking of the American election?
There are two very important points that need to be understood on this subject first. When you hear a phrase like, Russia wants to influence the American elections, I assure you the Russians aren't even thinking about the American elections. It's this small, tiny group of random people, some of them sitting in the Kremlin, who for some reason have set themselves this task. The second point, and one which still surprises me, that Americans do not understand, is that Putin doesn't run all of Russia. He doesn't even run his inner circle entirely. He's in general the guy who doesn't like to spend too much time working, and neither is he a great organizer. What he wants to be is a guy who can make everything look like it's humming along nicely, without him having to work at all.
Все работало само без него.
To America, it looks like Russia is trying to do things that are detrimental to the United States.
То, что вы иногда здесь на Западе пытаетесь...
What America sees as a straight policy line is very often just ordinary chaos. Yes, somebody there may have actually wanted to influence the American elections. What country doesn't? But the main reason for Putin, in my opinion, and one that your media seems not to understand, has nothing to do with America. What Putin wanted to show the Russian people is that American elections are corrupt. So the attempts were not to hack the election, but mainly to make it look back home like the votes were being falsified in Clinton's favor.
Клинтон.
What was Putin hoping to get out of that?
Он хотел организовать
Putin needed to evoke outrage from Trump supporters to support its thesis, not to accomplish any objective in America, but rather to show Russia, see, there are no honest elections anywhere in the world. The point Putin was making was subliminal. When I falsify elections in Russia, that's just business as usual. Everybody does it. I, personally, see this as Putin's main objective vis-a-vis the American election.
решали и другие задачи.
Now you know Putin, you've spent time with him, you've worked with him. What is he really like?
Когда Путин...
When there was a plan to appoint Putin president of Russia, I did not support him, but I didn't make any public announcements. I didn't say anything against either because I felt that's none of my business. I felt that Boris Yeltsin, the outgoing president of Russia, knows better than I do. If he thinks that Putin is the right guy, well, that's his business. Then for a while, I actually thought that Putin might have been a good choice. Putin's a very talented person in establishing communications. He mirrors you, so you see in him what you want to see in him. Then the situation changed. They started doing things that very obviously went totally against the grain of what I believed in.
Моим восприятием жизни.
So you discovered that Putin had changed, but did that change you, and how did your relationship with him change?
Я сделал шаг назад.
I took a step back and tried to minimize any interaction with him entirely. I worked with the chairman of the government. In fact, in that day there were lots of occasions that required interactions with Putin. I had my colleagues go to those events. At one point, I realized that a choice was being made about the direction of the country. There were two choices. The first is an open type of economy, transparent, slowly being built along Western standards. The second model is our traditional corrupt system. At this point, I already understood that if that path is chosen, a lot of doors get closed for us. I didn't want that, and many of my colleagues didn't want that either. That's why I went on the offensive and put Putin in the position where he had to make a choice against me. What I didn't know at the time is that he had already made his choice.
In Russia, the Beslan terror attack in Chechnya, where 500 school children were killed, is seen as we see our own 9/11. Do you think this was responsible for Putin's becoming so authoritarian?
Нет.
Quite candidly, no. In fact, Putin cynically used that attack to take away the region's rights to choose their own governors. That choice had nothing to do with the attack. I should preface this by saying I'm not an expert on counterterrorism operations. I do not know if there would have been more or fewer losses of life with another scenario. But it is absolutely clear that the decisions that were made with respect to the Islamic terrorists were, first of all, a decision to lie about the number of hostages, to lie about the situation in general, and secondly, I think the decision to make the attack was made by Putin because he did not want to give his opponents, an opportunity to get there first and play the role of peacemakers.
You were in prison when the attack took place. How did you find out what was going on?
Мне позвонили.
We were being allowed a limited opportunity to make phone calls to relatives. My parents told me that a large number of the school children after the attack were now in a hospital in Moscow. My parents said we want to help these children once they get out of the hospital, to find them places to live, because many of these children had lost their entire families, and they were all alone now.
What did you tell your parents to do?
I told my parents that's not going to happen because these children are right now in the spotlight and the government's going to be right there to make sure that it's the one that gets the credit for helping them. In the end, though, a few of those children, if my parents hadn't gone to their aid, would have had nobody there to meet them when they were released from the hospital. To me, this is profound. When you are the head of the country and a tragedy has taken place, and a month later you've forgotten about these kids that are being released from the hospital, something is very wrong. You asked me for my opinion of Putin. This man, Putin, does not have a heart. He may have something else there, but it's not a heart.
An opinion poll showed that 55% of the Russian people expect Putin to make Russia a great and respected country once again. Do you believe that?
Для старшего поколения
For the older generation, the memories of old Soviet Union's place in the world are very important. What's interesting is that the younger generation have divided into two parts. One half want to be part of the new global world. The other half want to be in a Russia that the world respects and fears. Respects and fears, to many Russians, actually have an equal sign between them.
Do you find any interesting parallels between Russia and America?
Я
In general, I think Russia and America are very similar. Both Russia and America are big, inward-looking countries. The overwhelming majority of Russians have never been outside of the country. The majority of Americans have never been outside the country either, except maybe a quick trip down to Mexico or across the border to Canada. From this point of view, neither Russians or Americans are all that interested in what's going on in the rest of the world. So yes, we're similar.
Do Russians still believe in socialist communism?
В экономической сфере есть
In the
серьезные
economic sphere, Americans, much more than Russians, think their personal economic future depends on them alone. In Russia, Siberians are like that. Central Russia is very much reliant on the state. America also has a segment of the population heavily reliant on the state, and unfortunately, this segment is growing.
So Russia and America share many traits in common, and yet Putin chose to go anti-American. Why did he do that?
Причина
The
очень
reason is simple. Things aren't going all that well in Russia. Putin needs to have some way of explaining it to the people. Can they blame the opposition? No, because of the image of the great Putin, who has dealt decisively with the opposition. There is no opposition in the country. Now, China can get a little scary, so that doesn't help.
So it turns out that it's not that Putin hates America, it's that America is just such a good opponent for him to have. Is that true?
Вот Америка очень хорошо, большая страна.
Look at America. It's great, it's big. People can believe that the Americans are capable of doing all kinds of nasty. America is a very convenient enemy that can be blamed for all of Russia's ills. It's located who the devil knows where, meaning not near Russia, and doesn't represent a direct threat to Putin.
When you were in prison, your mother Marina said it's hard to stay strong, but people should tell the truth and not be afraid. Did those words inspire you?
Для меня, как, наверное, и для многих
For
людей,
myself, what my parents think of me is important. There was a time back when I was working in the Young Communist League, and my mother said to me that she is ashamed that her son is working in the Young Communist League. I didn't understand it then, but it certainly had an impact on me. When my mother told me, "You have to remain strong and I'm proud of you," that really had an impact on me.
естественно.
What are your plans now that you're free?
I'm firmly convinced that my country needs more than just to replace Putin. I've seen in my life, and I'm convinced that any person who is Putin's place will become another Putin. We need to remake our state into a parliamentary republic. We need for this parliamentary republic to be based on a real federalism. What I'm talking about is something similar to what took place when the United States was founded. I think this works for Russia, because in this regard, Russia is a country like America. But for this to happen, we need to have young leaders.
Tell me, what are you doing with your think tank, Open Russia?
То, что я стараюсь сегодня делать
What I'm trying to do with Open Russia today is to help develop these young leaders. The work that we do is political education, participation in the elections, providing legal support and information to the society. Now, our organization has representation in 25 regions. There are 1,000 people who are official participants in this association. Despite all the pressure that the authorities are exerting, they continue their work. If I live to see the day that Russia gets a new political system, I will feel that this part of my life, too, has been a success. For anyone wanting to learn more about our activities, please go to Open Russia online.
Thank you very much.
Спасибо вам.
Terrific interview. Thank you.